When you think of a typical day in medieval times, what do you imagine? Peasants working the fields, knights battling in armor, royalty scheming for power? Well, how about we take a look at some of the more unusual professions that were around during this time period? Here are 7 crazy medieval jobs that will leave you shocked. Starting off this countdown, we have rat catcher. In the Middle Ages, rats were considered a nuisance and a health hazard. They carried diseases and could cause the spread of plagues. So it's no surprise that someone would be paid to catch them. Rat catchers would set traps and then collect the dead rodents and dispose of them appropriately. And yes, they did get paid. The payment depended on the severity of the infestation and the number of rats caught. But this job wasn't just for your typical peasant. It required skills and experience to effectively deal with these infestations. Many rat catchers were former soldiers who had experience in setting traps and handling dangerous animals. Next up is executioner. The job of the executioner was to carry out the death sentences handed down by the courts. This could include hanging, decapitation, or even burning at the stake. The executioner was responsible for ensuring that the punishment was carried out swiftly and humanely. He would also need to be skilled in the use of the various instruments of death. The role of the executioner was an important one in medieval society. In many ways, the executioner was seen as a servant of the law, someone who ensured that justice was carried out. However, the job was not without its challenges. The executioner was often looked down upon by society, and he was frequently subjected to public abuse and ridicule. But what about when you die? Well, that brings us on to our next job, gravedigger. Gravediggers were responsible for digging graves and burying the dead. This job was often done by prisoners or other low-ranking members of society. Gravediggers worked long and irregular hours and were exposed to the elements. Despite the unpleasantness of the work, gravediggers played an important role in medieval society. They were responsible for ensuring that the dead were buried properly and that the graves were maintained. Gravediggers were also sometimes called upon to dig up bodies for exhumation, which can be just as gruesome as it sounds. Now, if you ever found yourself in the unlucky situation of dying in the Middle Ages, you may have wanted a good gravedigger to ensure you receive a decent burial. Speaking of burials, how about we talk about a few other jobs that took place before your final farewell? Coffin maker. Coffin makers were responsible for creating the coffins used to bury the dead. They would typically work with wood, although sometimes metal or stone coffins would be made. The job of coffin making was often passed down from father to son, and there were strict rules governing the construction of coffins. For example, the wood had to be seasoned properly, and the nails had to be made of a specific size and shape. Coffin makers were also expected to be familiar with the various types of burials and to construct coffins accordingly. For example, they knew that some coffins would need to be made with special compartments for valuable items such as jewelry or religious relics. And let's say you wanted to go out with a bang, so to speak. Then we have fireworks maker. Fireworks makers were responsible for creating and setting off fireworks for special occasions, such as royal celebrations or religious festivals. They would typically work with a variety of chemicals, including gunpowder, sulfur, and saltpeter. Fireworks makers had to be very careful when handling these materials as they were often volatile and dangerous. One wrong move could result in an explosion or fire. Despite the danger, fireworks makers were highly skilled artisans, and their work was highly prized in medieval society. Barber surgeon. Surgeons in the Middle Ages were typically trained barbers. This was because barbering and surgery were seen as complementary professions. Both required a certain level of skill and precision, and both involved close contact with the body. Barber surgeons would typically work in their own shops, where they would perform a variety of surgical procedures. These procedures included setting broken bones, treating wounds, and even performing amputations. Barber surgeons were not typically employed by physicians or hospitals. Instead, they worked independently and set their own hours. This gave them a great deal of freedom, but it also meant that they were responsible for finding their own patients. To attract customers, barber surgeons often displayed their instruments in their shop windows. This was to show passers-by that they were available and willing to perform surgery. Plague doctor. Yes, we're talking about the infamous plague doctors of the Black Death era. They were the ones who treated victims of the disease, which killed millions of people in Europe in the 14th century. Plague doctors were typically physicians who had some experience in treating infectious diseases. However, the methods used by plague doctors were often more harmful than helpful. They believed that the disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. To treat the disease, they would use a variety of methods, including bleeding, purging, and blistering. These methods were not only ineffective, but they often made the patient's conditions worse. Plague doctors wore distinctive clothing, including a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a mask that had a long beak. The mask was designed to filter out the air and prevent the doctor from breathing in the bad air or miasma that was believed to cause the plague. We now know that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted by fleas. The plague still exists today, but it is much rarer than it was in the Middle Ages. Thanks to modern medical technology, we now have antibiotics that can be used to treat the disease. Now that you've learned about some of the crazy jobs that were around in the Middle Ages, you may be wondering what life was like for the people who had these jobs. What kind of training did they need? How much did they get paid? And what was a typical day on the job like? If you want to learn more about medieval life, stay tuned for more content. You won't regret it.